The town of Stillwater was known for its fog-draped mornings and eerie silences. At its heart stood the decrepit Stillwater Manor, a hulking, Gothic monstrosity that seemed to grow taller in the mist. For decades, the manor had been shrouded in tales of curses, madness, and whispers that beckoned people into its rotting halls, never to return. Evelyn Cross, a local historian, was drawn to the manor like a moth to a flame. Her fascination wasn't born out of mere curiosity. It was personal. Her great-aunt Miriam had disappeared into the house 40 years earlier, and Evelyn had spent her life piecing together fragments of her story. Now, armed with old journals, an ancient map, and a flashlight, she stood at the threshold of Stillwater Manor. The door creaked open, as if inviting her in. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying the faint metallic tang of something long decayed. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then stepped over the threshold, her boots echoing against the cracked marble floor. The foyer was a cavernous space, its once grand staircase now a sagging ruin. Tattered curtains hung limply from the windows, and shards of glass glittered like sinister diamonds in the pale moonlight. Evelyn's flashlight swept over the walls, revealing faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple like water. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She pulled out the map, its edges browned with age, and traced her route with trembling fingers. According to the journals, Miriam had been investigating a hidden room rumored to contain an artifact, an ancient mirror said to show the truth of one's soul. Evelyn wasn't sure she believed in such things, but if it held a clue to her aunt's fate, she had to find it. The path led her through a narrow corridor lined with portraits. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow her, their expressions shifting in the flickering light. She paused before one portrait, an imposing man with a stern face and eyes as dark as obsidian. Beneath the frame was a brass plaque that read, "Edgar Stillwater, 1834 to 1899. A sudden whisper caressed her ear, soft and insidious. "Turn back." Evelyn spun around, her flashlight shaking. The corridor was empty, but the air felt charged, alive with unseen presence. She pressed on, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The hidden room was behind a false panel in the library, just as the journals had described. Evelyn pushed against the carved wood, and it swung open with a groan. The room beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with shelves crammed with books and trinkets. In the center stood the mirror. It was enormous, its ornate frame crawling with carvings of twisting vines and grotesque faces. The glass was tarnished, clouded with a silvery mist that seemed to swirl of its own accord. Evelyn approached it cautiously, her breath fogging the surface. Her reflection was faint, distorted, as if she were staring through a veil. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold surface. The mist parted, and her reflection solidified. But it wasn't quite right. The face staring back at her was hers, but the eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too bright, and filled with a malevolence that made her stomach churn. "Evelyn," the reflection whispered, its lips moving out of sync with her own. "You've come so far. Shall we trade places?" She stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The reflection leaned closer, pressing its palms against the glass from the inside. "Don't be afraid. It's better here. No pain, no fear, just endless knowing." Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you?" "A fragment, a shadow, the truth of what you are," it said, grinning, "and what you could become." The room began to tremble. Books toppled from the shelves, and the air grew thick with a low, droning hum. Evelyn tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The mirror's surface rippled, and dark tendrils began to snake out, reaching for her. She screamed and grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, slashing at the tendrils. They recoiled, but the reflection laughed, a sound that echoed painfully in her skull. "You can't fight what's already within you," it taunted. "You brought yourself here, Evelyn. You opened the door." Desperate, Evelyn remembered the journal. Miriam had written about an incantation, a way to seal the mirror. She fumbled through her bag, pulling out the leather-bound book. The words were in Latin, and her pronunciation was clumsy, but she shouted them anyway. The mirror shrieked, the sound piercing and inhuman. The tendrils writhed violently, and the glass began to crack. Evelyn kept chanting, her voice growing steadier with each word. With a final, deafening wail, the mirror shattered, the shards exploding outward like a deadly rain. When the dust settled, the room was still. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Evelyn's reflection was nowhere to be seen among the shards, and the tendrils had vanished. She slumped against the wall, trembling. Her flashlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the wreckage. As she caught her breath, her eyes fell on something glinting amidst the shards, a small, silver locket. She picked it up, recognizing it instantly. It had belonged to Miriam. Tears welled in her eyes as she opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of her great-aunt, smiling warmly. On the opposite side was an inscription: "Find the light." Evelyn left the manor that night, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. She never found Miriam, but she felt her presence, a quiet reassurance that she had done what her great-aunt could not. The manor still stood, silent and brooding, but its whispers had ceased, or so she thought. As Evelyn drove away, her rear-view mirror fogged over, and for just a moment, she saw her own reflection smiling back at her. But the eyes were not her own.